particular prejudice and hatred against the Jewish people. And as we're studying fascism and the history of fascism and Nazism, it's very important that we understand anti-Semitism. Now, for the most part, the virulent hatred of Jews and the blaming of Jews for the country's problems occurred in Germany and not so much in Italy. But as Germany and the Italians were allies during the war, both with fascist-style governments, the hatred of Jews by the Germans did rub off to a certain extent on the Italians, and especially when the country of Germany effectively controlled northern Italy, it was able to implement its attack against the Jews in that part of Italy in the same way that it had done in Germany as well as other countries that it had taken over. And so there the final solution was implemented against the Italian Jews. What I'd like to do, though, is kind of take a step back and make sure we understand that anti-Semitism is not something that just sort of popped up out of the blue in Germany due to this very odd and nasty ideology of Nazism, but had been around in European history and culture for quite some time. First of all, you've probably noticed that Adolf Hitler, in his speech that you've read, used a particular term to describe the German race, and that term is Aryan. Now, the term Aryan itself comes from the past and didn't necessarily always have the connotation that Hitler applies to it. It's a term that comes from the Indo-European linguistic group. You can find it in the ancient Sanskrit and Greek and Latin, and Northern Indians and Europeans could both be said to sort of loosely be from this early racial group that comes from the Indo-European. But Hitler takes this term and uses it specifically to mean German, and even to mean a certain ideal of the German, an ideal that he personally didn't actually meet, but which was often extolled by the Nazi ideology of the big, strong, blonde, blue-eyed German, which he claimed was of true European stock. The true Aryan was exemplified by this type of German figure. So this Aryan is compared by Hitler to the Semite, to the Jew, who in every way doesn't compare favorably at all. Anti-Semitism, as I've said, is literally prejudice against Jews, not Arabs in general. And if we look at, the question of what was the cause of this, why did Hitler so quickly latch upon this, and why was it such a attractive theme for the Germans at this time? Well, there's so many different answers to that question. Some of them are universal answers, some of them are particular to the time and place in which this happened. But for a long time, as I said, anti-Semitism been a major part of the European scene. And part of the reason for this was just the general resentment that Christians had over their very existence. The fact that the Jews were still there, that the Christians had not completely overcome them or convinced them of conversion, that they're still there to remind them that there was this group of people, which the Bible does refer to as God's original chosen people. And that claim, even though in the Bible and Christians purported to believe the Bible and everything that it said, that claim to be God's chosen people, that special race, was resented. And of course the idea was that Christianity superseded Judaism as God's role in the world, as it brought into light by the role of Jesus Christ, who himself was a Jew, which is also conveniently forgotten. So there is this resentment, or was this resentment, and still is, amongst certain groups. Also, there was a accusation against the Jews as so-called killers of Christ, a particular interpretation of the Bible in which the Jews as a group were responsible for the demise of the Lord, and therefore of special, deserving of special condemnation. They were different, and any group that is different in its habits, practices, and its religion is always a possible target also for ostracism and discrimination. Forever, the Jewish people, all the way back in biblical times, of course, all the way up to the present time, have refused to worship any other god, and this got them in trouble even in ancient times as they clashed with civilizations for whom there were many gods and who didn't mind adding on a few more when they met up with another civilization who had ones whose names they didn't recognize. The Jews right away said, no, there is only one God, and it's as we define it, and so in the Middle East, this was a source of anti-Semitism. Also, in Europe, there was a resentment against the Jewish people due to their perceived economic success. Now, ironically, the reason for any perceived economic success was largely due to Christian discrimination. Christians during the medieval period believed that they could not lend money at interest, which they called the sin of usury. But since Jews weren't Christians, they could loan the money at interest, and did, being excluded from many other professions in order to make a living. And so they got the reputation for being the money lenders, and that's dirty business, etc. And so this was added on or heaped on to the list of complaints against the Jews. In medieval Europe, all the way up to the time of Nazi Germany, Jews tended to be separated physically into neighborhoods or ghettos in which they would live separately from the rest because they weren't accepted by the rest of society. So there's a lot of history that goes along with what happened in Nazi Germany. Some of that history, as I said, is from the past, and I'll just go over in a little bit more detail. Of course, you know that the Roman Empire refused Jews citizenship and persecuted Jews at different times during its history. In medieval Europe, I've already mentioned the money lending issue and some of the general attitudes. There was also the Inquisition as a policy of the Catholic Church during, and particularly at certain times during the medieval past, in which Jews were, jailed, put on trial, accused of apostasy or of just disbelief, and attempts made to convert them. The Jews were expelled en masse from Spain, and repression of Jews was particularly strong in England, France, and Germany. Jews were, during the medieval period, often forced to live in ghetto areas or walled areas where they would have limited influence on Christians. Their economic activity was restricted, and incredibly similar to the Nazi era, sometimes they were forced to wear badges to delineate that they were Jews and not Christians. And if they went outside of their own area, they had to wear this badge in order to identify themselves. Now, forced segregation of Jews was generally abolished in the 19th century, but still, there's a big difference, as I said. It continued because there's a big difference between forced or legal segregation and absolute social segregation, as we know from how blacks in America were treated for quite a while after, even after segregation was no longer legal. Neighborhoods continued to be segregated. In Russia, in the late 19th century, there were wide-scale pogroms, that's P-O-G-R-A-M-S. They're massacres in which Jews were attacked by military forces or just by vigilante groups. And these pogroms forced them to flee from wherever they lived, and in some cases to flee to the United States. Some of the United States Jewish population comes from that period of time, and of course more comes from the period of time in which the Nazis gained control of Germany. They also, during the 19th century, began to establish colonies in Palestine to go back to their native homeland, because they were being literally run out of places in Europe. In Germany, in the late 19th century, anti-Semitism was an organized movement with concrete theories of racial superiority. As you could tell from your readings, these theories became more, I wouldn't say sophisticated, but more attempting to explain exactly why Jews were inferior biologically and so forth. Um, During the late 19th century, Jews were often spoke of as a sort of parasitic group, a group that latched on to another culture and sort of sucked the lifeblood out of that culture, and it had no culture of their own, but rather lived off of others. So this was not a new characterization of Jewish people. They were seen as nomadic, as not really having any sort of homeland, and it was denied that they had any sort of homeland in the Middle East. Of course, the 19th century was when Zionism first got started among Jews and people who were sympathetic to Jews as a solution. So the idea of going back to Jerusalem, to the Jewish homeland. So because of all of this, because of all this history that goes back really all the way to biblical times, and the Jews clash with other groups who believed in multiple gods, the Jewish clash with new Jewish Christian sect. If Jews didn't convert to that new, basically Jewish Christian sect, there was a division there that continued to grow and widen until the two kind of saw themselves as completely different religions, and the Christians began to persecute Jews. To the medieval period, where an awful lot of the basic components for that virulent anti-Semitism of Germany were already in place. Then it shouldn't surprise us that after World War I, when Germany had suffered a humiliating defeat, when the people were suffering, when they had to pay huge reparations due to the Treaty of Versailles, where they were being severely punished by the Allies for starting the war, and they had to endure all this suffering, that they looked for a scapegoat. And the most obvious scapegoat, the group that would leap to mind because of what had taken place already in the past, was the Jewish people. So with that background, perhaps it seems a little less mysterious or bizarre as to why Adolf Hitler chose the Jewish people for his blame and why he felt so strongly about it. Of course, it's still a wonder how so many people could see what was happening, and that their neighborhoods were the Jews were being rounded up from their neighborhoods and taken out of their place of employment or business or whatever, and disappearing. It's still amazing, of course. It will always be amazing that people stood by and watched this happen and didn't do anything about it. But it certainly I hope that it helps to know a little bit more about this. There is a reading that is posted on this section, or this module, which goes into anti-Semitism and what it is and its manifestations even more, which I would like you to read as well.